Malda College. There is hardly any need to introduce the legendary professor Supriya Chaudhuri, uh, who's authored various books and she's a renowned, globally reputed scholar. And I think I should give a very brief introduction as she has already told me. And she is a major contributor to the Oxford Taylor translations and has translated Tagore's Jogajog to relationships. And she has edited writing over medieval to Renaissance along with Professor Shukanta Chaudhuri. He has contributed with Professor Sajni Mukherjee in literature and gender. And her expertise, we already are acquainted with her expertise on modernism, on literary theory, on cultural theory, and Renaissance. So she specializes in history of ideas. And today we are going to listen to her. It is always enlightening to listen to her, to listen to Supriya. Welcome, Supriya, a most hearty welcome. And today we are going to listen to her talk, and it's on women's space, which I think it has become more and more important day by day, because already during the pandemic, domestic violence has created major furor, and how to connect theory with practical life, with day-to-day experience. I would welcome Professor Chaudhuri to enlighten us. I would request all of you to mute your microphone and your video. So, Supriya, please start.
Thank you very much indeed. I would like to begin by thanking Professor Jyotir Mohi and Dr. Anuradha Kundu of the Department of English at Malda College for inviting me to speak to their students today. It's a pleasure to be addressing students again, though I would always prefer to do so directly, face-to-face, and not on an online platform and in virtual space. I've chosen today to speak on women's space, and I had thought of focusing principally on Virginia Woolf's Cambridge Lectures from 1928, published in 1929 as A Room of One's Own. But as I thought about the more general implications of this title, I realized that my discussion might draw in other texts and reflections, for which I hope you will forgive me, they will arise in the course of my discussion. In a series of critical interventions dating from the late 1970s, the feminist geographer Doreen Massey insisted that gender as a determinant needs to be added to the analysis of space and place in human geography, complicating what has come to be known as the spatial term in politics, history, and sociology. To summarize very, very briefly, because we don't have time for it here, this spatial term, drawing significantly, sorry, there's somebody who said that he is not getting sound. Is there a problem for
No, ma'am. You're perfectly audible, ma'am.
Fine.
You're perfectly audible.
Yes. Then to summarize, this spatial turn, drawing significantly upon the work of Henri Lefebvre in a book called The Production of Space, which was first published in 1974, argued that space is not an abstract, unbounded entity, as opposed to place, which is localized and defined, but space is also socially produced as a web of interlocking social relations. And Lefebvre is famous for his spatial triad, which distinguishes between perceived space, conceived space, and lived space. I won't go into this. Massey complicates this triadic description considerably by suggesting that space is not just a static three-dimensional category, but a four-dimensional complex also inflected by time. That is to say, it's more correct to speak of space-time rather than just space. And Massey then goes on to say, given that conception of space, a place is formed out of the particular set of social relations that interact at a particular location. But the identity of a place, dependent upon this specificity, may still remain somewhat open and provisional, despite the fact that places like cities, markets, streets, and so on can be located on a map and possibly named. For both space and place, Massey argues, gendered experiences are critical in forming social relations. She cites her own experience of looking at playing fields as a child in Manchester from the top of a bus and seeing that only boys are playing in those playing fields. Now, let's turn to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which was published in 1929, long before these theoretical developments, long before the spatial turn in literature and sociology. For those of you who haven't read this book, and there may be, I do recognize that I'm speaking to students, it's very likely that there are many here who have not actually read A Room of One's Own. Let me just quickly explain that this book is based on 2 lectures, ostensibly on women and fiction, delivered by Virginia Woolf to women students at the colleges called Newnham and Girton colleges in Cambridge in 1928. And they were published in this book form when they were given the title A Room of One's Own in the next year, 1929. Now, when she delivered these lectures at Cambridge, this was some 20 years before Cambridge University actually started granting degrees to women. This didn't happen till 1948. And you may know that by contrast, Calcutta University granted degrees to women. The 2 first women graduates of Calcutta University were, as I'm sure most of you do know, Kadumbini Ganguly and Chandramukhi Bosu in 1882-83. So that's actually 60 years before the University of Cambridge started granting degrees to women. But there were residential colleges in Cambridge where women did pursue studies, though they could not get degrees. Now, I think that there is importance in the indefinite article A Room of One's Own, that the title A Room of One's Own, which was given to those lectures, I think suggests a great deal through the indefinite article A in the title. The room is an undefined space, a woman's space that remains hypothetical and unrealized for all that Woolf takes us on an imaginary journey towards it in the book itself. It's stated quite unequivocally in material terms. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. This is what Woolf says. But it remains qualified by the subjunctive if. If she is to write fiction, she must have money, etc. And it's very different then from the realized possessive of Jacob's Room, a book that a novel that Woolf wrote 7 years earlier in 1922. The room in A Room of One's Own is a space that paradoxically never takes full shape in a text that is almost entirely about different places, most of which are indeed localized, described, and identified. I'd suggest that the politics of space in A Room of One's Own deliberately sets the text's own modernist poetics of rich phenomenological recall, its ability to denote and describe places where women feel themselves to be excluded or confined, against the imagined space, a room of one's own, that they need but do not have. At the start of A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf takes us on an imaginary walk through Cambridge. describing a recognizable and vivid topography that's also the background to her own train of eager, vibrant thought. As she lingers by the river, she has an idea and she wants to pursue it, so she hurries back to the college, walking over the college grounds, over the grass. But immediately she is accosted by a college official who tells her that she is not permitted to walk on the grass. The grass is reserved for the male fellows and scholars of the college. Then she goes on a kind of walk through Cambridge, attempting to follow Charles Lamb's footsteps into the library of Trinity College, which holds a manuscript presented by her own father, Sir Leslie Stephen. But again, her way is barred by a college official who regrets that women are not allowed in the library. After this second expulsion, she doesn't try to enter King's College Chapel, but strolls around the court until it's time to go into lunch. And the lunch is very pleasant and convivial. Her husband is the principal invitee. She is just going along with him. And she feels replete and satisfied. Sorry. She feels replete and satisfied until she glimpses a tailless cat, a Manx cat, crossing the lawn. Sorry, let me just quickly stop this.
Sure, ma'am.
Thank you. Hello? হ্যাঁ, আমি একটু একটা কাজে ব্যস্ত আছি, একটু তাড়াতাড়ি বলে নেবেন? হ্যাঁ, তাড়াতাড়ি বলে নেবেন। হ্যাঁ, 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 কেন? ভেরিফিকেশনের জন্য এসছেন? আমি একটু কাজে ব্যস্ত আছি। আচ্ছা, সরি, 1 মিনিট। হ্যাঁ, আচ্ছা, 1 মিনিট আমাকে, I'll just come back in 2
Okay.
It's a bad thing, so I have to come. ঠিক আছে। আচ্ছা, শুনুন, আমি একটা কাজে ইনফ্যাক্ট একটা অনলাইন
I request all of you, if you have any query, kindly put your query in the chat box, please. Kindly note that a feedback link would be shared in the chat box. Please do fill it up. I repeat, a feedback form will be shared in the chat box. Kindly fill it up. Ma'am, kindly unmute yourself.
Sorry. So I'm really sorry. It was a bank official who had come and was waiting outside. And during the pandemic, it's really difficult that you have to
Yes.
attend to so many things from home. Otherwise,
Yes.
you drop them off. I'm really, really sorry about
It's
this.
all right.
Yeah.
Absolutely all right.
So anyway, I said that, she has this rather frustrating experience in Cambridge where she is not allowed to walk on the grass or to enter the Trinity College library, but she has an excellent lunch where she is a guest along with her husband. And she sees this cat walking, padding softly across the quadrangle. And she feels that something is missing in this apparently learned, sociable, beautiful place. And I think the obvious Freudian explanation for the Manx cat is that Virginia Woolf realizes that what is missing in this cultured, sociable, learned company is woman, a being also notoriously defined by Sigmund Freud by lack and envy. In perhaps the most notorious modern example of an exclusionary ideology of the body. And other kinds of lack await Woolf as she proceeds to the women's college to which she has been invited, Newnham, or Fernham as she calls it, where she finds that there's only a plain meal, no money, no degrees, and no prospects. And subsequently, she resolves to investigate why it is that women are in this situation as compared to the men who clearly own and rule over a university like Cambridge. So as she commences her investigation, which she carries on in the British Museum, where a public building whose great dome is encircled by famous male names, she explains almost apologetically that she actually does have a room and a certain amount of money. She has a room and a desk, as well as £500 a year left to her by an aunt. But she feels in some sense apologetic about possessing this limited freedom and independence, because she realizes that most women do not have even these scant means. Those of you who have read A Room of One's Own will remember how the waves of the argument, especially Woolf's most famous invention in this book, the story of Shakespeare's sister, who lies buried in an unmarked grave in London. This is Woolf's own invention. She invents a sister that Shakespeare might have had, but did not have, who was equally gifted, but did not have the kind of career and success that Shakespeare did. And all these waves of argument that Woolf constructs in the lecture, in the series of lectures, flow from the idea of the room where Woolf is sitting and writing these thoughts. The house where she opens the door and goes indoors, where she has books on her shelves and paper on her desk, and where the light of an October morning falls on her desk through uncurtained windows. This is the vantage point from which she looks at the world outside and at the passing stream of people, where she notes various incidents and events happening in that London morning. She notes particularly a young man and a woman entering a taxi and being swept away into the roar of the London traffic. For Woolf, as for Walter Benjamin in his Arcades project, it is the simultaneous porosity and impenetrability of street life, the mingling of the casual and the important, the architectural conjunction of domestic and public buildings that makes modern literature possible. And you can see Woolf busy at her desk, working on the draft of these lectures, and also thinking about what fiction should do, what kind of life fiction should capture, and how important it is for her, that she has this room in which to work and a window through which she can look out at a more open space of cars and people, passers-by, pedestrians, traffic, and the buildings of London. So what emerges here is a spatial turn to literature itself, made possible by the new contiguities and social relations of the modern city, something that perhaps offers a degree of hope to the woman writer. But Woolf's own room, that is to say the vantage point from which she sits and develops these thoughts, reflects upon the exclusions to which women are subject, and writes her own, and will write in the future, not just these two short essays, but also more novels, more stories, more fiction. This room is not precisely the space that she proposes to her women audience, the audience of students whom she addresses. She's careful to record that women have made some economic and political advances, that they have gained the right to property, they've gained the vote, and they have and professions to women have opened up to some extent. She is herself the beneficiary of some of these reforms, but she bitterly regrets her lack of formal education. But what Woolf proposes to her audience is not this accidental, the fact that she has a room and some money. Rather, her recommendation is for the future. It's in the shape of an idea. Women need space. To write, one requires space, privacy, leisure. These can only be acquired by work, by contact with what Woolf calls reality. So you need both interior space and exterior space. You don't need the room by itself. You need the room with the window through which to look out at the world outside. The room of one's own, the book, places this imaginary or conceptual space, an empty space belonging to the moral economy of art, against the actual spaces that are inhabited at that time by men and women in the world. And it's important to remember that Woolf, while in this particular set of lectures, in this book, she's talking about the need for seclusion or privacy, or the room of one's own with a lock to put on the door. In other essays, she does talk about open, relatively more unbounded space as well. In her 1927 essay, Street Haunting, a London Adventure, Woolf wrote about the possibility of escaping from her own room, a place of both seclusion and exclusion, privacy and captivity, into the street, walking in the city, like the female counterpart of Walter Benjamin's Parisian flanier. Now, the flanier is a character, a stroller, an idler in the city, created or named by the famous modernist writer Walter Benjamin, or Walter Benjamin. The fact that we have to use the French word flâneurs for the female counterpart of the male flâneur tells us something about the gendered professional associations that the activity of walking in the streets has for women. So while you can speak of men walking in the streets, if you say that a woman is a street walker, you are saying something completely different. In gender terms, you are saying that basically she is using walking in the streets as a sexual profession. So when Woolf writes this essay, Street Haunting, she is speaking of the pleasure of walking alone, unencumbered in the street at night, rather like Charlotte Bronte also does in a much earlier novel called Villette. And she speaks of the beauty of London streets when they are deserted, when with their islands of light. And she also looks in on these lighted windows and sees inside the figure of a woman accurately measuring out the precise number of spoons of tea which she is going to pour into the teapot. She looks at the door as if she hears a ring downstairs and somebody asking, is she in? So in a room of one's own, there is actually an unresolved contradiction between private space and public action, seclusion and society, being locked out and being locked in. Woolf emphasizes that a woman should not only have a room, but the power to put a lock on it. It is an exclusionary idea of a kind. The locked room and the money together sound rather middle class, rather blind to the fact, as Alice Walker pointed out, that many men and women do not have the luxury of a room or the leisure to walk in the streets for pleasure. Rather, they have to suffer bitter hardship and deprivation. And from these ranks, writers also emerge. Indeed, both men and women may write without any room to call their own or money to support them. Woolf's proposition that a woman must have money and a room of one's own if she is to write fiction is to some extent rooted in the class anxieties and class assumptions of her own social position and her place in the historical time to which she belongs. In 19th century Bengal, Rasasundari Dashi, who wrote the first prose autobiography in the Bengali language, taught herself to read in the kitchen, concealing leaves of her husband's Chaitanya Bhagavat under the coals, taking time snatched from the immense, unending labor of household chores and without space or privacy. So too, almost a century later, another Bengali woman writer, Jyotir Mohi Devi, in a novel about the trauma of partition, Epar Ganga, Opar Ganga, recalled Woolf's room of one's own directly in describing the quarters that her heroine, Shutara, rents in Delhi. And she says, I'll read this passage in Bangla, Na ghor noy, bari noy, grihosthali noy, narir sneho, করুণা মধুর স্বজন ভরা নীর তো নয়, কিন্তু নিজের ঘর নিজের অর্জনে অর্জিত নিজের একটা স্থান, সেটা নীর কি ঘর কি? এতদিনে এটুকু সে বেশ বুঝেছে যে ঘর তার জুটবে না, তবে সে কি স্বাধীন হয়ে গেল? মেয়েরা কি স্বাধীন হয়? Now, Jyotir Mohi Devi does not actually here cite Woolf directly. In the Bengali original, the Woolfian echo picked out, if we translate the line into English, is not quite so clear. It was a room of her own. But Jyotir Mohi clearly links women's economic independence to the social status of women's labor in an era of decolonization. 2 years later, Jyotir Mohi wrote an account of her own writerly beginnings. Married at the age of 10, widowed at 26, Jyotir Mohi learned to read and write in both Bengali and English, finding solace in her grandfather's library. She expresses bitter resentment at being denied the right to independent selfhood or independent thinking, and mentions Woolf in the context of women's exclusion from the life of the mind. And she says, in the foreign writer Virginia Woolf's work may also be found an awareness of this absence of the life of the mind and of the intellect felt by a woman. She has also discussed the circumscribed life that women lead, their limited sphere of thought, the plethora of social strictures, and the indifference of patriarchy in a room of one's own. So it's quite clear that Jyotir Mohi had read A Room of One's Own, and she refers to it directly in this essay. However, Jyotir Mohi doesn't place so much emphasis on having a room of one's own and a place within which one writes. Rather, she says that what women need is a sense of connection to the outside world. Developing a familiar theme of Bengali aesthetics, she connects the word for literature, shahitya, with shohit, meaning togetherness, or as she puts it, sannidha, closeness, or the companionship of another human being. And she says that human beings and all writers need kinships of the mind. They need to be connected with other people and with other writers. It's this that women lack. So Jyotir Mohi doesn't simply reiterate Woolf's feminist manifesto. She reshapes the argument by pointing to precisely those intellectual circles, those kinships of the mind that Woolf in her Bloomsbury oasis could take for granted. For the emergent woman writer in a deeply patriarchal and conservative society, albeit one that had been profoundly shaken by the anti-colonial struggle and the trauma of partition, the claim to intellectual kinship outside the home engages a critically important debate in Indian modernity, which is that between the home and the world. As she sees clearly, Woolf's room, precisely because it exceeds the sphere of the domestic, is meaningless unless it provides a window to the world. That Shutara eventually exchanges her solitary tenement for intellectual companionship in marriage doesn't really solve the problem. Now, it's worth noting, and this is my principal digression here in a talk that was supposed to be about Virginia Woolf, it's worth noting here that the struggle for women's education, Stri Shikha, and women's rights, Nari Rodhikar, in 19th century India, particularly in colonial Bengal, was conducted almost entirely in spatial terms. The terms of a binary between outside and inside, home and the world, private and public, Ghor versus Bahir, Antapur versus Boitukhan. If in Bonkim's historical fiction, the liminal position occupied by women is situated at the boundary, let us say, of nature and culture in Kopal Kundala, public role and domestic duty in Devi Chaudhurani, or politics and conjugality in Anandamot, and articulated through a spatial narrative involving the movement of his individual women heroines from one sphere to another. Rabindranath Tagore explores this binary in slightly different terms in his short stories, as well as in longer fiction like Chokher Bali, Noshto Ner, Ghore Baire, or Strir Patra, and the late unfinished novel Jogajog. Rabindranath's understanding of space with respect to women's lives is much more nuanced and complex than a simple opposition between seclusion and emancipation, Ghor and Bahir. It's central also to larger debates within Indian modernity. If you look, for example, at the short stories, most of them composed in the last decade of the 19th century and set in rural, riverine, pastoral Bengal, many of these focus on the cruelties, neglect, and oppression experienced by women through marriage, through domestic labor, and what we might call the gendered and material displacement that takes place through marriage itself, the inevitability of women's exile and migrancy. In patriarchy, home is constituted by the woman, and yet the woman never is in her home. This is evident, for example, in the short story Shubha, as in another short story, Khata, exercise book, where the child Uma, married at 9, loses with her exercise book the only solace of her childhood and her claim to self-expression. Very often, in many of these stories, the the only vehicle for the tenor of feelings that would otherwise go unrecorded is a spatial image. And this Rabindranath repeats so often that it's difficult to even summarize instances. On the one hand, you have some instances where the woman character is alone with nature, as in a moment in Shubha, the young mute girl sitting under a tree at noontide, looking out at the endless expanse of the natural world and feeling her kinship with it. On the other hand, you have other instances where the young girl is confined in her marital home in a single room. And this happens, for example, in Kata. At the turn of the century, under the pressure of what he called Shangshare Ruro Sporsho, the harsh touch of domesticity, Rabindranath turned away from the short story to the novel. And this generic shift from short story to novel is also a spatial transformation from the relatively open settings of rural Bengal to the oppressive interiors of the bourgeois household. And there is a much more clear distinction of space between the Bhitor Bari or Antapur and the Bahir Bari or Boitukhan. Now, this separation obviously can only be maintained if the dwelling is substantial enough to permit it. For example, in the short story Shasti, there is really no distinction between inner and outer spaces as such, whereas in a novel like Chokhir Bari or in Charu, negotiations of internal boundaries are required of the women characters, and they are required always to negotiate the space within which they find themselves and where they can find a modicum of solace. For example, Rashasundari Devi, writing her autobiography shortly after mid-century, superimposes upon the domestic geography of kitchen and labor room the infinitude of her spiritual and intellectual desires. So on the one hand, you have the actual oppressive geography of domestic space within which she is confined, and on the other hand, you have an infinite yearning for her. For the deed, for God, and her yearning to express herself and to write. In Rabindranath's representations of such processes, you have, for example, in the novella Nostoni, a kind of tracking of affective relations through space. So too, you can make similar points about the negotiation of domestic space by women in Strir Potro with Mrinal's final escape, Ami Bachbu, Ami Bachlum, and in Ghore Baire, which is built on the binary of home and the world, or in Jogajog, where Kumudini tries desperately to resist the property relations and sexual slavery of modern marriage by retreating into increasingly confined spaces, the storeroom or a spot on the terrace. And where in these novels, we might ask, is women's space? It's not a question of actually possessing a room or having a space to which to retreat. Often you find that the images in the texts textually represent the women as building a place of self-imposed seclusion within the domestic interiors in which they are trapped, which are the only space in which they find privacy and solace. So in Nostonir, we have, in this way, Charu dug a tunnel under the entire structure of domestic tasks and duties. And in that unlighted, silent darkness, she built a temple of secret grief. And there's a very similar passage about Kumudini in Ghore Baire. So, and we also, both in Nostonir and in Jogajog, Kumudini in Jogajog, both in Noshtonir and in Jogajog, the lost self that these women seek to protect and return to is sometimes associated with a village past, Amar Gram, with the empty sprawling fields, the copses of wild tamarisks and the towpath that they have left behind in childhood, they can no longer, in a sense, return to. So this might suggest a contrast not just of Ghor and Bahir, private and public spaces, but of the past and the present, the country and the city, the remembered village and the colonial town. For Tagore's women, this lost self, the self that is linked to unbounded open space, for example, the woman or the person who is imagined in Niruddesh Jatra, the poem Niruddesh Jatra. Important though it is as a kind of placeholder, a dialectical counter in the struggle for self-representation remains always already lost. It's as though it's not realizable, and yet it's very important for women to hold on to this idea of an open and unbounded space within which they might find fulfillment or realization. And within the world in which they live, women actually, or at least as represented, have no space. They only have a place that is assigned to them and where they must fulfill the functions, the duties of a wife or a daughter or a member of a family. Right. Now, at this point, having having gone through this digression, let me return to Woolf. Woolf never gave up thinking about this problem of a space for women and how women can function or operate in a society that seems so much to exclude women. In 3 Guineas, a much later anti-war text focusing on male violence and state-sponsored militarism, Woolf seems to have moved on from an earlier notion of the secluded private space of art, a room of one's own. Not only is 3 Guineas a much more public book, attempting to make a difference to a national political decision, that is to say, whether to join a war or not, it's also much more distrustful of the enclosed institution, the Women's College. Though Woolf sends one of the guineas, the 3 Guineas of the title, to a women's college, but she proclaims herself a member of a society of outsiders, bent on disruption and dissent. Yet one of the facts that makes Woolf's novels so difficult for a post-colonial woman reader is that while she asserts her gendered status as an outsider, she was in fact, by virtue of her race and class, an insider. Woolf is never really rid of the burden of her own private, unearned income, and she recognizes that her own freedom of choice is based on her class privilege and her access to some private family money. Nevertheless, 3 Guineas is in many important ways an advance on a room of one's own, with its uncompromising rejection of the cloistered spaces of academic or intellectual freedom, preferring exclusion to inclusion, being out to being in. She draws a parallel in this work to between women and other oppressed groups. And she notices that a room of one's own could, in some societies, be easily convertible to a prison or a madhouse, and the privileged space might easily become Mrs. Rochester's attic or the Nazi concentration camp. She says angrily in 3 Guineas, "You are feeling in your own persons what your mothers felt when they were shut out, when they were shut up because they were women. Now you are being shut out. You are being shut up because you are Jews, because you are Democrats, because of race, because of religion. It is not a photograph that you look upon any longer. There you go, traipsing along in the procession yourselves. That's to say, she's trying to show that what women suffer is what all oppressed groups suffer. And until all oppressed groups recognize their kinship with all women, nothing can change. She examines a set of photographs sent by the Spanish government, and she says that one of the photographs is of a house that has been bombed, and there is therefore no distinction of outside and inside. You can look straight into the living room where there is a bird cage and there are dead bodies. And the lesson that Woolf takes from this physical, visual collapsing of inside and outside, the bird cage in the bombed, ruined sitting room, is to reflect on inner and outer in another way with respect to the private and public worlds. She mentions Sophocles' play Antigone, and she says that Antigone is a woman who offers love to the dead and whom Creon entombs alive, putting her in a small place where she is enclosed by herself because she has defied the law of obedience and the rule of seclusion placed upon women. She tells us that the public and private worlds are inseparably connected. The tyrannies and servilities of the one are the tyrannies and servilities of the other. So I quote from Woolf, "They must be women and not range at large. Servants, take them within." That is the voice of Creon, the dictator, to whom Antigone, who was to have been his daughter, answered, "Not such are the laws set among men by the justice who dwells with the gods below." But she had neither capital nor force behind her. And Creon said, "I will take her where the path is loneliest and hide her living in a rocky vault." And Creon, we read, brought ruin on his house and scattered the land with the bodies of the dead. So what we have here is almost imperceptibly, Woolf's room of one's own becomes somehow equated with the rocky vault in which Antigone is entombed alive. We must remember that Woolf's pacifism and her opposition to the war brought out in her a kind of public engagement which she had not perhaps earlier taken up so strongly. And she was by no means the only writer of her time to engage in this almost pathological opposition to war and to its cruelties. Ernst Toller killed himself in New York in 1939, Joseph Roth in Paris in the same year, Walter Benjamin in 1940, Stefan Zweig in 1942, Simone Weil starved herself to death in the same year, 1942. In the context of this troubled, tragic close to a life lived in impossible tension between the inner and outer, private and public worlds, let's ask again whether the room that she imagined, that Woolf imagined, could ever have contained or satisfied the woman writer, all the more so in the context of her declaration, "As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world." This is in 3 Guineas. Now, if Woolf's room remains, and I'm close to finishing now, if Woolf's room remains a tragic, unfulfilled possibility in its immediate modernist context, let me close by looking at a postmodern reinvention. And what I've tried to say, and I will summarize the main lines of my argument, which got a bit interrupted in between, towards the close, let me just say that from the modernist setting of Woolf's room of one's own and the kinds of argument about privacy and public life, about writing and acting that are worked out both through this book and in Three Guineas, I'd like to move on here, right at the end, to a postmodern reinvention of this work. In 2014, the multimedia artist Kabe Wilson produced a site-specific performance, The Dreadlock Hoax 2014, which inverted one of Woolf's own performances, The Dreadnought Hoax, and on the other hand, offered a recycled version of Woolf's talk on craftsmanship, which she gave on BBC in 1937, on just around the time that she wrote Three Guineas. This was posthumously published in The Death of the Moth and Other Essays in 1942. The performance by Kabe Wilson introduced Wilson's novella Of One Woman or So by Olivia Ngafri, which was itself the product of a 5-year project of recycling the 37,971 words of Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Let me just briefly explain this because you may not have understood what happened. Woolf offered in this presentation 2 reordered or reshuffled literary texts. He took all the words of Woolf's lecture on craftsmanship and reordered them to make a new presentation, a new text. And similarly, he took the 37,971 words of A Room of One's Own and reordered them into a novella, a short fiction called Of One Woman or So by Olivia Ngafri. The name is an African name. And this, he said, was following Woolf's own injunction in craftsmanship to combine the old words in new orders so that they survive, so that they create beauty, and so that they tell the truth. Now, Kabe Wilson's recycled texts adhere with almost impossible frugality to the laws of a thrift economy. Exactly all the words of craftsmanship are reordered into a speech introducing Olivia Ngafri's book. Exactly all the words of A Room of One's Own reappear exactly the same number of times, so that there are just the same number of words in Of One Woman or So. Now, if Kabe Wilson had not actually done this, you wouldn't have thought that it could be done. His recycling is, in a way, a formal philosophical devoir to the logic of discourse itself. His intervention breaks down the determinism of the text by deconstructing it. And what does he do with that text? In the disassembled and reshuffled work, Wilson's heroine is a girl called Olivia Ngafri. She is a mixed race student, black student, in Cambridge in 2009, 80 years after Woolf lectured there on women and fiction. But she finds herself in the Cambridge of the 21st century, similarly alienated and excluded. Her struggle to escape is also fueled literally by books, and especially by Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own. She is baffled and repelled by what she calls the old novels, poetry, and even older essays that make up the backbone of her course. And I hope that you will understand that I introduced this example out of a sense of your, students in India, what students in India face when they are required to read Wordsworth's Daffodils or Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, and a set of familiar, repeated English classics, and feel themselves repelled and excluded from that kind of canonical literature. So this black heroine of Kabe Wilson's novella finds herself repelled by these old novels, old poetry, and even older essays, and she is required by her tutors to write an essay on Thackeray and to read Jane Austen. She attends a Shakespeare Society meeting where she is racially abused as a negress. And Olivia turns, therefore, to the Black Power radicals of 1960s America, especially Stokely Carmichael, responding to their exhortation to burn it all down, to burn Cambridge down. If Virginia Woolf had been excluded from Cambridge by the bar on women scholars, Olivia finds herself excluded by the still entrenched racism and sexism of the Western literary canon and of a Western institution like Cambridge University itself. Recycling a room of one's own involves for Wilson a mixing of Woolf's reordered text with other past texts, like those of diasporic West Indian and American writing about racism, including women like Toni Morrison, Bell Hooks, Octavia Butler, and Zadie Smith. Now, what is interesting in Woolf's recycling, in Wilson's recycling of Woolf, is, and coupled with his subversive admixture of Black Power or genderqueer material, are elements of a critique directed at the inescapably Anglo-centric narrowness of vision enshrined in both A Room of One's Own and Craftsmanship. Although it offers emancipatory hope to all women, indeed to an androgynous creative imagination, A Room of One's Own is rooted in the soil of Woolf's own upbringing and her sense of English literary history. Woolf's advice remains confined to uneducated English women like herself, for whom she recommends 500 a year each of us and rooms of our own. Reading this iconic text for the first time as a young student in India in 1969, I remember reflecting that if every woman in the world had 500 a year and a room of her own, global poverty, a far more pressing concern for someone like myself, would cease. Woolf is caught up in the most familiar of discursive traps, a Foucauldian determinism that limits her because of her age, her race, her class, and her sensibility. How then is she to intervene in this field of force, overturning existing hierarchies of value and disrupting through her feminism the systemic violence to which she bore witness in all her work, but particularly in Three Guineas? Because I don't think that it can be doubted that Woolf actually did do all these things, despite her upper class prejudice and her incipient racism or anti-Semitism. She chose to become a member of a society of outsiders. And she says, to be at once inside looking out and outside looking in, this is possible for her because she is a woman, experiencing within herself those splits and ruptures that mark all systems, however entrenched and hegemonic. If one is a woman, one is often surprised, she says, by a sudden splitting off of consciousness. Say in Walking Down Whitehall, this is in A Room of One's Own, I'm quoting her, when from being the natural inheritor of that civilization, she becomes, on the contrary, outside of it, alien and critical. What is for Woolf a splitting of consciousness, allowing her, an insider who is also an outsider, to dismantle the sustaining myths of patriarchy, needs to be reproduced as a deconstructive gesture in Kabe Wilson's disassembled and reconstituted text. For Jacques Derrida, this would require a hermeneutic lever, an undecidable that can inhabit philosophical opposition without constituting a third term. Taking his cue from Jane Marcus, Wilson employs a kind of aporia in the text, where Woolf, in the text of A Room of One's Own, mentions a black woman, a very fine negress, as she calls her. Now, this marks for Woolf the difference between Englishmen and Englishwomen in respect of their contrasting senses of nation, culture, and civilizing mission. The deeply problematic implications of Woolf's sentence are brilliantly laid out by Jane Marcus, who asks in passing why Woolf couldn't conceive of a woman like herself being both black and British. Now, what Wilson does is to use this lever, collapsing it into the black British woman, to unwork Woolf's text from within. He creates this character of Olivia and Gauffrey, a black British student in the Cambridge of the early 21st century, who is on a mission, as it were, to dismantle the controlling hierarchies of Woolf's world and of the British literary canon, and to create a space for herself. How can she create this space? She can do so in this text, in Carby Wilson's text, by rewriting the work, by writing it afresh, writing it differently, writing it anew, by making a new kind of uncharted space, a space of possibility that might be women's space. Now, I've finished more or less what I wanted to say here, but I'd like briefly, because I do understand that I've covered a lot of somewhat disparate ground, to summarize. I'd like to summarize very briefly what I have tried to say in this presentation. By starting with feminist geography and the idea of women's space, I wanted to make the point that space is made out of social relations, that it's not just an abstract unknown which surrounds us and which we inhabit without precisely being able to define it. As we know, place can be defined, space can be described perhaps, but it can't quite be defined. Now, then I moved on to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, and I suggested that although Woolf is very careful in describing all the places which exclude or confine women in the England of her time, she projects as a possibility a room, an undefined space, which might be a space of freedom, of possibility, of writing, of leisure, and of fulfillment for women. And interestingly, that room, as it takes shape in imagination, in possibility, through the text, it doesn't take full or complete shape, but it is suggested. It is not quite the same as the space that Woolf herself inhabits, the desk at which she works in her study room. She says, and it's quite clear from her description, that she requires both that space where she sits and writes and the window and the access to the outer world, which provides the substance of her writing. You remember the start of Mrs. Dalloway. Clarissa says she would buy the flowers herself, and she plunges into the heart of the London streets in order to go out on a kind of shopping expedition and to buy the flowers. Now, for women, that access to the outdoors, to the exterior, is as important as having that space of confinement or of seclusion within which they can, it appears from the way Woolf puts it, fulfill themselves through writing. A woman must have a room of one's own and money if she is to write. However, and then I embarked on a brief exposition of the contrast of interior and exterior spaces in Bengali literature and culture of the 19th and early 20th centuries, where again this contrast of interior and exterior is obviously not an exact or static set of binaries, but always changing in terms of how it is inflected by women's desires and possibilities. Thus, outer space might be the space of public action, but it might also be the space of freedom and communion with nature. So too, the household space could be a space of captivity and confinement, but it might also create, it might be also be possible for women to create within that space an internal solace, internal space, internal region of comfort and solace. I then moved back to Woolf's later work, Three Guineas, where Woolf seems to have abandoned that idea of the room and the seclusion and the comfort of £500 a year, and says that she is part of a society of outsiders. She notes that women are subject to oppression, and she writes in an angry and an indignant way about the possibility of England going to war. And she cites Sophocles' Antigone, where she says that it's impossible to separate the private and the public. In effect, she is saying the personal is the political. I then ended by suggesting that postmodern reworking of a room of one's own also turns upon this of spaces which women are excluded. But here in this particular reworking, the space is the space of the English literary canon or the British literary canon, from which this young, queer, black woman student feels to be excluded, and she takes it appears the radical decision.
I just want to ask you whether
Can I take?
Sure, ma'am.
So my Dinia's question is with men is that, in my opinion, men gain women a place, and they may on occasion seem to give or allow space, but women's space needs to be created by women themselves. I mean, I think that this is a distinction of space and place. Men may assign a place. I'm not sure they can create a space.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. And I wanted to ask you whether Ashapurna Devi's Shubhanalata, who was asking for a baranda, was asking for a veranda of her own. Can that be related to this window space through which the woman could look outside? And another question, whether when there's actually an evolution in Woolf's writing and thought, and from Room of One's Own to Three Guineas, she starts about thinking and talking about class distinction and class problems. Do you think that in case of uneducated people or mass, women are aren't women doubly exploited? Because a man who is exploited outside, he comes home and exploits the woman once again, and so the woman who is exploited outside and inside, she's doubly exploited. So I would like to.
Yes, thank you. I'll just quickly answer both those questions. Yes, I think that the baranda in Ashapurna Devi's novel is very much a kind of spatial image, spatial metaphor for the kind of space of freedom, or that the woman craves, and actually, her life, she wants it but doesn't get it. It seems as though it's something that she needs, and it's conveyed through a spatial image. It's not the physical space itself. I mean, it's as though the baranda is the concrete emblem of a desire that for all her life remains very largely unfulfilled. I mean, there's a kind of partial fulfillment towards the end, but it's very limited. And the second one, yes, about double exploitation and oppression, yes, this is, of course, it's very much the case. And this is, it's constantly the case but I don't think that it's really so much to do with class. I think that this kind of exploitation and oppression happens across classes.
Across the class.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. I think there are some other questions.
So one person asked me to repeat the name of the postmodern rewriter of A Room of One's Own. It is K-A-B-E, Kabe, K-A-B-E, Wilson. Wilson just spelled like Wilson, W-I-L-S-O-N, Kabe Wilson. You can look him up on Google. The book which he created, Of One Woman or So by Olivia and Gaufrey, which I say, as I say, it's a novella created out of the words of A Room of One's Own, it's not available in print. It's an artwork. It's not available in print, but you can read about it if you look up Kabe Wilson. And there were other names that people asked me to repeat: Jyotir Mohi Devi, Epar Ganga, Upar Ganga, and her autobiographical writings about her journey as a writer. What else? Somebody was asking about technofiction or something like that.
Yes, ma'am.
I didn't get that question.
Okay. Ma'am, Saran Parial asks, ma'am, do you think in postmodern conditions, cyberspace or any technologically meditative space is more inclusive and flexible for women to express themselves more independently?
You know, I think that the politics of gender, it is not a question of the kind of space you have, whether cyberspace or technologically mediated space is more open, more free. I don't think that space has these, and that was the point that I was trying to make through the presentation, that I don't think space has properties of its own. Space has properties as a result of social relations. The production of space is a social act. So it depends upon the relationships that are there in society as to how space is produced, mediated, or enjoyed. Cyberspace, or let us say, imagined spaces like the spaces of science fiction, could also be imagined as intensely oppressive spaces. Writers might find themselves, equally at a disadvantage in imagining or controlling or negotiating such spaces. One could, if this question has, in a sense, it has two aspects to it. One is, what is the kind of fiction that you are putting out there, as it were? And that depends on what kind of writer you are, and whether and what kind of space or what kind of world you are imagining. And this depends on who you are or what you are as a writer. And secondly, there is, of course, a question of technological access. For example, the print revolution obviously made a difference, though over a period of several centuries, to women. Women's emancipation, women's, to a certain degree of freedom and the possibility of self-expression that was gained by women, was made possible by the technological revolution of print. So if you say that the digital revolution creates other equally important possibilities, yes, you would be right in saying that women have access to digital means to express themselves. Women have many more avenues within which to express themselves through digital media. But at the same time, I'm sure every one of us is aware that the digital revolution has also brought in its wake in unimaginable cruelties and oppression directed to children and women. So children are abused and made the target of all kinds of pornography and abuse through the fact that digital media exists. So too, women too may be exploited, abused, and their independence taken away. They may be blackmailed, they may be harmed by the fact that these new technological means make all kinds of online exploitation, trolling, and persecution possible. So you can't say that a particular technological medium is in itself a medium of emancipation. It depends on how one uses it. And if one uses it in liberal and emancipatory ways, imagining new kinds of gender relation, yes, it could be emancipatory. But if not, it could also be very oppressive, hostile to women. And indeed, I'm sure every one of us is aware how much women are subjected to online trolling and abuse.
Thank you, madam. There are a few comments, I think. There are several comments on YouTube also.
Yes.
Dr. Shomiprendo Banerjee says, such a dense presentation, Supriyadi, as usual, enriched by aspects. And there is one question I can see. Ma'am say something about postmasters Ratan.
Ratan. So, I mentioned some short stories, and I really wanted to mention Ratan in The Postmaster, because Ratan is a character who is really represented in confined spaces. She is shown doing the domestic chores for this young man, this postmaster who has been assigned to an unfamiliar Bengal village and who is always only thinking of how soon he can get out of it, how soon he can leave. And this young girl, actually she is a child laborer basically, is assigned the task of looking after him, doing his domestic chores, fetching water, looking after him when he is ill. And ultimately, when he receives his release order, is to move to a different place, he immediately accepts that, and he thinks for a moment whether he should allow, he should take Ratan with him, but he doesn't. There is no question of doing that, and he leaves. And at the end of that of that short story, there is this extraordinary passage in which a wave of grief emerges like the swelling river in his mind as he looks back to the village where Ratan is there in her little place, and he feels for her, and yet he doesn't know what to do. Ratan is really example of a kind of unthinking oppression that is taking place daily in the rural settings. Ratan badly, that he oppresses her directly, and yet he does not think of her. He just allows her to occupy those, that small area and to carry out those minor domestic chores, and her life is entirely confined by that kind of setting. And she is entirely confined in the setting. Whereas, you remember Satyajit Ray's film of that story, Postmaster. It's a film that is, largely, it's very dark, darkly lit. No really open, like Shamapti. Shamapti is very sunlit, it's very open. But Postmaster is not. Postmaster is very dark. It's very confined.
Thank you very much, madam. I don't think there is any more query. So now I would request Dr. Anuradha Kunda.
Can I just ask one more question?
Yes, please.
Okay, I was wondering about Clarissa and Mrs. Dalloway and Woolf's idea of space in that novel. Is it in contrast to a room of one's own, or because we find that in some way Clarissa's space is a little problematic with context to the social aspects and how she is utilizing that?
Yeah. Thank you. That's an interesting question. There was so much that I would have liked to have discussed, but didn't have the time to. Clarissa in Mrs. Dalloway is a bit like Woolf herself, or at least she belongs to the social class that Woolf also inhabited. But of course, she lacks Woolf's capacity for intellection and for analysis. So Clarissa does not reflect upon her female condition in the way that Woolf herself does. But if you think of her social position, well-bred, well-brought up, well-established wife of a public man, a man who has a public role, he's a member of, the civil service, I think it is. Her husband, is it Sir Richard? I think he's called Sir Richard. I forget exactly, but he appears also in The Voyage Out. So there is another novel in which the same characters appear. So he is, he's busy with his public work, just as Leonard Woolf was also, busy with his public work. But to a considerable extent, of course, Virginia herself was part of the social circles in which Woolf moved, and she was able to share, to a considerable extent, particularly through the activities of the Hogarth Press, she was able to share to some degree in the public life led by Leonard Woolf. Leonard had also, of course, resigned from the civil service before he married Virginia Woolf. And after that, the kind of work, the kind of public work that Leonard Woolf did was largely voluntary. It was part of his own public activism. This is not the case with Richard, with Mrs. Dalloway's husband, who is, I think, a member of government or a civil servant or something like that. But she has considerable, to some extent, a considerable degree of freedom. She's able to walk about, she's able to order the flowers, she's able to organize the party. And yet, even in Mrs. Dalloway, there is a critical moment when she feels great anger at being excluded from a lunch to which Richard is invited, but she is not, because it's a kind of, official government kind of meeting, and she is not part of it. So she feels the exclusions and the anxieties of an and in that respect, she also feels it almost as a psychopathological condition. So to some extent, she is nervous, anxious, not quite stable. There's a kind of instability in Clarissa, which draws other men to her. There are several men who are in love with Clarissa, who are drawn to her, attracted to her. But she herself doesn't seem to be fully secure in her position in society. There is a degree of insecurity, of instability in her character, which is produced perhaps by the nervous tension of being a woman who has access to power, but is powerless herself. What is she? She's an uneducated, upper-class English woman. And Virginia Woolf recognizes this very clearly. She says it of herself, that she's a woman who did not get an education. She was not able to go to school or college. She was not able to learn Greek. She was a woman of great intellect, of great intelligence, and yet she could not have an intellectual career like her contemporary men. And Clarissa Dalloway, without that quality of intellect, is also in some way disempowered by the fact that she is a woman, and yet empowered by her class and by, all the things that go with her class. She's a bit racist, a bit anti-Semitic. She's, very, very, she's a very typical upper-class English woman. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. There is one question asked by Shirupa Mukherjee on YouTube.
Yeah.
Is the space ultimately a state of mind as well, where some women, despite coming from a place of opportunity, choose confinement over freedom and expression?
Yes, absolutely. It is a space of mind. And in fact, it depends on how you are able mentally to map your own space as to what kind of space you might enjoy. Ashapurna Devi writing her novels, Jyotir Mohi Devi writing her novels, Rasha Sundari writing her autobiography. All of these are a triumph of the mind over circumstances, aren't they? They are very much a creation of personal space and the space of writing in very unpropitious and not particularly helpful, unhelpful circumstances where the physical space that is afforded is practically non-existent.
Thank you very much, madam, for attending these queries also. Now I would request Dr. Anuradha Kunda, the convener of this webinar and special lecture series, to deliver the note of thanks. Ma'am, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Jyotir Mohi. I don't know how to express my thanks to Professor Supriya Chaudhuri for this illuminating and wonderful, thought-provoking lecture. Because when the time has come, we can still see that women are the agents of patriarchy, and some sort of confinement in thoughts is still found. And the jokes like men be men are very popular in various medias. I think this lecture will certainly enthuse many of us to rethink, because from Virginia Woolf to Jyotir Mohi Devi, Rasha Sundari Devi, and to Cabby Wilson then, and to the later works of Three Guineas of Virginia Woolf. It's a huge range. The range of the lecture is so huge and so great and so thought-provoking that it will certainly inspire, I think, motivate many of us, many of the listeners today who have attended the lecture to rethink and to think about space, to think about time, to think about confinement and unconfinement. And once again, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for being there. I would also thank the principal of this college, Dr. Manush Kumar Boito, for arranging this webinar series for us. And I would like to thank the entire faculty, the students, and all the YouTubers also who are present there with us today for being with us. Supriya, thank you very much once again for being there with us.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you for everyone, who attended and asked questions. And my thanks to the principal of Malda College for making this possible. It was a pleasure to meet all of you, but as Anuradha knows, I would much more have enjoyed a visit to Malda myself. And perhaps when this pandemic is over, that will be possible. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, we'll be waiting for that, because you have been here, and once again,
thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, once again. The session ends here. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.